You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guests today are Dr. Owen Emmerson. He is a social and cultural historian, the author of 3 books, a contributor to a number of television documentaries. He also works as castle historian and assistant curator at the stunning Iver Castle in Kent, and that's England to all you Yanks. He is also the co-founder and a primary contributor to Iver Castle's online subscription service, Inside Iver Castle. Our other guest is Kate McCaffrey. She is the assistant curator at Iver Castle. She completed her master's degree with distinction in medieval and early modern studies at the University of Kent. So there's 2 of us who can pay the bills with a master's degree in medieval history. They are active and they're delightful on social media, which is how I quote unquote met them. You should definitely follow them both if you want beautiful pictures of the castle and the grounds and updates on their research and just the beauty that is British history. Dr. Emerson's Twitter handle is at Dr. Owen Emmerson, 2 M's. And Ms. McCaffrey's is at Kate with 2 E's, McCaffrey. And before I get started, I want to shout out to 2 people. One is the wonderful Helen Francis, who does the PR work there at the castle, which is what I do for a living here in Indianapolis. She was wonderful and she was kind. We wouldn't have had this interview without her. And second, I'm going to thank Dr. Susanna Lipscomb, because a year or 2 ago, I can't remember which, she answered my email from out of the blue to say, hey, please come on my podcast. And she did. And that has opened the floodgates for so many wonderful, wonderful historians whose names I'll mention later in the podcast. And so, Dr. Lipscomb, thank you so very much for your kindness in coming on. And I must say hello to you both from Gareth Russell. I just posted a podcast with him a couple of days ago regarding his book on the Titanic. He said you both are wonderful and to tell you hi.
Oh, love that. We love Gareth. So hi back.
So his books are amazing. I've read 3 of them and they're just terrific. So let's start. It's April. We're not that far away. Kate, we'll start with you. What are your hopes and expectations for the upcoming coronation of King Charles III?
Oh, goodness. I am incredibly excited to witness it. I would say it's a once in a lifetime. I'm not sure if it will be actually for us, but it's a very
You're young.
very special experience. Obviously, we've not seen one in so many years after Queen Elizabeth II reigned for so long. But yeah, it's going to be an incredibly historic occasion. So we have it as a bank holiday here. Usually I actually work bank holidays here at the castle, but we have it off. I have it off specifically so that we can watch it. And yeah, I think it's just going to be a magnificent occasion. I'm excited to see the pomp and the ceremony and history, to see what they include, to see what they deliberately don't include in comparison to previous coronations. I think word on the grapevine is that Charles is adjusting certain things to maybe modernize it slightly. So it'll be very interesting to see what he chooses to exclude in that vein. But it's certainly going to be a very historic occasion. And as historians, that's what we live and breathe. We're watching living and breathing history. So it's very, very exciting.
And here in the States, every 4 years, it's the same thing. Like, there's not much mystery. Owen, go ahead. What are you looking for? And what do you hope to see both as a Brit and as a historian?
So I'm very much like Kate in that my main focus, I think, will be on looking at the changes. I think one of our monarchy's key to success is by suggesting that there is this enormous amount of continuity with the past, whereas in fact, actually, I would argue that that's slightly a myth, and that monarchy has been continually evolving and shifting and changing, very subtly, often lagging perhaps behind popular opinion, but it is a sort of a living and breathing institution, and it has shifted enormously over time. So although there is this amazing sense of continuity with the coronation, there is also a huge amount of change. So actually, if someone from 500 years ago were to attend Charles's coronation, I think they would understand all of the principles and all of the gestures, but it would seem quite foreign to them also. And I love that about history. I love studying continuity and change. That's sort of the ingredients of what we look out for, as it were.
Do you believe this coronation will be more like William IV as opposed to George IV?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think it's probably going to be less stripped down than we have been led to believe it's going to be. I mean, part of the pomp and ceremony of coronations is necessarily quite expensive. So I should think it's going to be quite a costly affair. It probably won't be quite as ostentatious as coronations of the past. But I suppose I'm more fascinating in the shifting symbolisms and what they mean, what they're trying to speak to in today's society. So that's going to be really fascinating to study, actually.
Do you anticipate disruptions? I had a fellow on named Christopher Anderson, and he wrote a biography of Charles III, and he came on my podcast. I don't know if you know Christopher. He'll actually be over there doing commentary. I offered to do his dry cleaning or whatever it took to be over there, and I don't think he has the budget. But I'm going to hold the podcast with him until closer to the coronation. Do you think there's a chance to have some drama one way or the other? And how do you think the Brits will react to that?
I think there'll definitely be drama involved. I think where the royal family go, drama tends to follow in some way, shape or form. I think obviously the most topical drama will probably be around the attendance or the non-attendance of Harry and Meghan. And I think it'll be interesting to see if they show up. And obviously they've been invited. And I think the media will certainly jump on that. But I think there'll definitely be an element of drama, and there'll be controversy as well. That there always will be with things like this, in terms of, again, I think especially at the moment, how much money is being spent on the coronation, how popular it is. There's always interesting debate about these kinds of big topics. But I think for the most part, the feeling in the country is one of excitement, just because it's not been seen in so long for most of us.
I think there would definitely be probably a Republican presence. That has always been present in English society, and it will be an optimum opportunity to voice that opposition. So I don't necessarily know if that will be a drama. However, our press is quite good at spinning things, and so I very much expect that if there is any drama, like Kate, it will be to with regard to Harry and Meghan.
The levelers aren't still hanging around anywhere.
It's going to be really interesting because they do seem to be trying to avoid controversy at every opportunity. So, for example, I read recently that the Queen will not be holding the ivory rod that is normally held. And of course, we know that she is going to be wearing Queen Mary's crown as opposed to having her own crown fashioned, or indeed wearing the crown of the late Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. So therefore avoiding the famous Kohinoor diamond. So they do appear to be trying to get some good PR going before the fact.
Helen, Francis, they need you. Call them.
Absolutely.
Okay, Kate and Owen, I'll put you on the spot. That's what we do here in the States. If you were in charge, would you invite Harry and Meghan?
Oh, my word. I think I would. I think it's the diplomatic thing to do. I think it would probably cause more drama if they were not invited. I think it would give the press and a lot of other people the opportunity to really spin stories about that. I think it's quite clever in that it puts the ball in their court, and then it's their decision whether or not they want to come. So yeah, I think personally I probably would. I don't know what you think.
If I was in charge, I would invite them and crown them, and then cause a hell of a fuss. I love drama.
Yeah, there's no substitute for class. You invite them.
Don't put me in charge. Whatever you do.
Are the one more question on this topic before we get to? Are you guys, either one of you, working TV or radio or anything for it? I know Tracy Borman and several other historians are doing quite a bit.
They are. No, thankfully, I have been overlooked, which is good because, oh my goodness, I don't think I could tell you half of the things. I'd be really good at giving commentary of an early modern coronation.
Yes, yeah.
But things have changed quite a bit, and I'm not very good at names with the current royal family either. No. So I think
we're happy to be watching from the sofa. I think this coming up.
Yeah.
Tracy Borman is a machine.
My God!
And on the monarchy, she's just an expert on all monarchs at this point. Yeah. So no, she's stellar.
One more question on this before we move on is Kate Middleton, the Princess of Wales, is she as popular in Britain as she seems to be from across the pond? She seems to be the queen of British Twitter and fashion and parenting. And she obviously does she's a beautiful woman, of course, but she does a marvelous job of having that common touch, which obviously flows through her veins, given, her modest upbringing. Mm-hmm. Is she just that popular?
I think it depends who you ask. Here, I think she has a lot of fans here, definitely. And I think a lot of people are enthused by the younger generation of the royal family, by Kate and William and by their family unit. But I still think, there are those people here, as I'm sure in the US, who prefer Harry and Meghan to Kate and William, and this kind of weird sort of divide that's been created. So I think it just depends who you ask. But she is, I think people like to think of her as a sort of people's princess, really. And I think there's a lot of Diana imagery that's often used when looking at Kate in current kind of society.
Yeah, it's really strange. One, I completely agree with what Kate says. I think there is this almost encouraged false dichotomy between, being pro Kate or pro Meghan, which isn't particularly helpful to either of them, I don't think. But Kate's actually had quite a difficult time with the press. Quite often she is called bland and unimaginative, and I think actually that's probably helped to sort of consolidate some support for her, because the general public tend in England and the wider United Kingdom to like an underdog, and particularly when the press can be vicious and show their teeth. I think it can, sort of consolidate some support amongst people that wouldn't naturally be supportive, I think. So, yes, I don't think we ever get to know these people, to be honest. It's so superficial. We're always seeing them through a very specifically curated lens, and particularly skewed ones too. So yeah, I'd be very intrigued to sort of get to know them on a different basis.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. We're talking to Dr. Owen Emmerson and Kate McCaffrey. They work at Iver Castle in Great Britain. It's a beautiful place, and we're talking all things coronation and monarchy and history. They're very kind. They've stayed late at their place of work out there in Kent, England, to talk with us. Let's talk history and historians for a while. There's a terrific, when I was in graduate school, which was 25 years ago, there was a lot of Geoffrey Elton, Scarisbrick, Warren, those were the folks. My graduate thesis was actually on Sir Thomas Erpingham, who was commander of the archers at Agincourt. And so there were a lot of older, Anne Curry, who's not older, but I mean, there weren't a lot of sources that you could get here in Indianapolis about it. You kind of relied on it. In the last few years, decades maybe, there's been a terrific new cadre, especially of female historians in British history, military historians, the Tudor Stewart especially. I mentioned Susanna Lipscomb. I just mentioned Tracy Borman, Nicola Tallis, Helen Carr, who I'd love to have on the podcast, Sarah Gristwood, who did come on. Everyone's been on except Ms. Carr. What perspectives do the female historians bring to a modern study of a glorious past?
I think absolutely crucial ones. I'm very lucky to be entering this field at a time where there are, as you say, so many brilliant female voices being heard at the moment, and over the last sort of 10, 20 years particularly. I think history, as with most things for many, many generations, was dominated by men and by male voices. It was often through the male voices that we learned about history. I think half of that comes from the fact that the sources we refer to, especially when you're looking at early modern or medieval history, were often written by men, mainly because of educational differences and literary differences and opportunities that were given to men that weren't to women. So I think to that extent, we can't separate gender from history, but looking at it now with the female voices that are coming through, I think it just brings a whole new range of perspectives. And we're very lucky that not just with diversity in male and female historians, but with diversity across race and across sexuality with historians and all sorts of different areas. There's a really wonderful increase in new voices being heard. And I think that's translated actually a lot into the work that we're lucky to be a part of, which is re-examining characters in the past that we think we know a lot about, like Anne Boleyn, who is obviously the sort of heroine of our castle where we work, and looking at her with a different lens. I think that helps when you have new voices in the present to apply to old figures in the past. It's incredibly helpful and inspiring for me personally as a young woman entering this field.
And they're just delightful people besides being utterly brilliant. Owen, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with everything that Kate has just said. I was the very, very fortunate recipient of some amazing women who worked at the University of Sussex, where I completed all three of my degrees. I was supervised by an extraordinary woman called Professor Claire Langhammer and Professor Lucy Robinson, and they completely revolutionised how I see the past. I think one of the ways in which you can get that sort of grounding that's necessary to get a different perspective is just by understanding that women's lives were often chronicled by men. They were then archived by men. They were summarized by men. And actually, it gives you far more of an impetus to go back to original sources and to try and fill the gaps in a way that, traditional narratives just didn't even think to consider. I mean, if for example, if we look at just the collective works that focus on the 6 wives of Henry VIII, we only ever see the wives through the economy of being married to Henry. Actually, historians over the last 20, 30, 40 years, chiefly women, have been liberating these women from only being bound by their collective husband, and actually thinking about who they were as people, what they brought to the table, what kind of agency they enacted, and what kind of change came about because of their efforts. And it's a really, really exciting time, because we're often being told that there's nothing new to focus on, particularly with Anne Boleyn, because she is such a sort of redolent and often explored character. But actually, I think we're just getting to the tip of the iceberg with these women. And I'm thoroughly enthused to be working amongst some of the most talented women and scholars I've ever known.
I get beat up by some of my friends because I don't read fiction. And I always say, if I want murder, sex, romance, betrayal, I just read about the Tudors. Now, I'm sure I am missing some things, but in your research, if you could solve any mystery in British history, which one would you solve?
I don't know why, and this is a controversial one, but why my mind immediately goes to the princes in the
This
tower.
is in the tower.
And I know there are lots of really loud voices in that field, and lots of loud opinions in that. But I think it really is one of the greatest mysteries, because I don't know if we'll ever find the answer. And I love the ideas that have been floated about maybe one of them escaping and coming back, and we have those impersonators in Henry VII's reign, like in Warbeck and Lambert Simnel, and if they were one. And I think probably the most obvious answer is maybe just staring us in the face that we'll never find them, and that they did die in the tower. But it's a brilliant mystery in that I think it has all of those elements of a drama today and of a murder mystery today. From even just the evil uncle who's involved, quote unquote evil uncle, by the way.
Yes, I don't know if the Richard III Society listens to my podcast, so I don't want to get angry letters. But there were 2 bodies that were found in the tower. My understanding is, and I think that maybe Dr. Tallis and I discussed this, or maybe we all did, is that Queen Elizabeth has refused to have any examination. But King Charles III is said to be open to it. Do you think that he will do so? What do you hope to discover, if there is this forensic examination?
Well, I think it's a really interesting idea, especially coming off the back of the recent research done by members of the Richard III Society, Philippa Langley in particular, and obviously the team of archaeologists who worked alongside them, but those who recovered Richard III's body from the car park in Leicester, which is just a marvellous story. But that, I think, sets a really interesting precedent, obviously, of uncovering these bodies and kind of finding out more information from them. But I would be very surprised if Charles did uncover these bodies and do testing on them. I think it opens up a can of worms, legally and ethically. And to be honest, I don't know if it would give us a satisfying conclusion. I think there will still be many questions on if those 2 bodies are indeed the 2 princes. It still doesn't necessarily answer who is responsible for their murder, and there's still so many questions around that. So I'd be intrigued, but I would be very surprised if anything happened with it.
Oh, and what mystery would you solve that's not the princes in the tower?
See, I've never really been that interested in mysteries.
Weirdo.
I know. I should rephrase that. Never really been interested in sort of like the classic mysteries. I do like a good mystery novel, and I love a murder mystery. But in terms of, I've never really fixated. I think the mysteries that I'm interested in are absences from the historical record, rather than sort of who done it. So one of the biggest mysteries for me is that what was in Anne Boleyn's letters to Henry VIII. That's one of my enduring fascinations. Because
did she sleep with her brother?
Oh no, I definitely don't think she's sleeping with her brother. No. So yeah, it's things like what was said in that room at that time. For example, we know that Anne agreed perhaps to an annulment of her marriage before she was executed. What was said to her to convince her of that, and did she agree on? There are little
gaps that need filling
that fascinate me. I find those like enduring mysteries rather than who killed who. Yeah.
Has anyone figured out Stonehenge yet?
See, that's another good one.
Yeah.
They're the real ancient mysteries.
Yes.
There's so many to look at. I think that's part of the fascination of modern audiences today with history and with all different eras, but particularly I think there's so much interest popularly today around the Tudor era, just because, as you said, it's got all the drama of a modern soap opera.
Yeah.
Like, what more do you need?
I can't think of it. So, Owen, who killed the princes in the tower? Figure this out.
Richard III, definitely.
They're going to come.
No, not definitely. Not definitely. But I read, it's Occam's razor, isn't it? I think. I'm often asked by people who don't think it's him, what precedent is there for him doing something that, awful? And I think usurping the throne, taking it away from, two young children, sort of is in that vein. I don't think he thought much of taking the crown away from them. And yeah, I would be surprised if it wasn't.
Kate, are you on Team Owen?
I think there's a lot of nuance there. I'm going to try and give a diplomatic answer. No, I think, to be honest, as with most mysteries in history, the answer is often staring you in the face. I think that's probably the case with this as well, in that Richard is the most likely culprit, I think. I like the theories about the other people involved, but I don't know really what they have backing them in terms of historical evidence. I think that Richard is the most likely, but I enjoy the discussion around it, definitely.
Yeah.
They have the Tudor period started in 1485 after the Battle of Bosworth, which I hope to go see sometime soon. Bosworth is both a seminal and a watershed battle in English history, but is it bigger than that? What did Bosworth and the Tudors bring to England that didn't exist before their dynasty?
That's a very interesting question. I think Bosworth and the Tudors obviously come on the back of many, many, many years of the Wars of the Roses and all the instability and insecurity and danger that came with that, in terms of not knowing who was the monarch, whether it came from the Lancaster line or the York line. And I think, although their claim was probably more tenuous than most, Henry VII's claim was quite tenuous and came largely through his mother, through an illegitimate line. He, I think, did manage to bring a certain amount of stability after a very long period of turmoil, particularly through his marriage, obviously, to Elizabeth of York, and kind of uniting the two warring houses. So I think stability is something that he brought, but it was at a big cost, and it wasn't overnight. It came in gradual shifts, and it meant that he had to eliminate quite ruthlessly lots of people who dared to either challenge him or also have a claim to the throne that may be considered competitive to his own. So I think that that's a big thing that they brought in terms of symbolically bringing to an end these years of warfare and civil war. But it wasn't a quick process, was it?
No, and I think the Tudors more broadly can, they bring a sense of national identity that probably didn't exist before, and also a myth of independence, particularly with the break in the Church in Rome. This idea of the monarch being an emperor and looking, I suppose, outward independently. I think that still exists to a degree. I don't think you can explain our break from the European Union without understanding the sort of precedent that occurred during the Tudor era, this both inward and outward looking sort of perspective that very much characterizes the Tudor era, I think. And more broadly, the establishment of a navy and huge shifting cultural changes. This is the first era in which we know what people looked like, because they had a sense of realism about their approach to art that perhaps didn't exist in earlier generations. I think, there is a sense of closeness to this era. And I don't think it's any sort of surprise that they are an enduring part of our cultural and educational environment today. They are well up there on the syllabus, aren't they? And on the entertainment.
And I think they sort of coincide with and also spur on those kind of huge cultural movements that were happening in Europe at the time, like the Renaissance. The advent of the printing press in the West kind of coincides with their coming to power. So there's all these huge transitional shifts that are happening at the same time as their dynasty, which they help to further on, but also which help them to further on. It's a brilliant kind of coinciding. So it's a key, 100, 200 years of change with or without them.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. We're just talking history with Owen Emmerson and Kate McCaffrey of Ever Castle. Is there a particular American leader or legend you admire most, Kate?
Oh goodness, you put me on the spot. I studied a lot of the American civil rights movement during school, and I think someone who stands out as an obvious is Martin Luther King Jr. His speeches and his oration and his words, I think, are some of the most powerful in the 20th century. I was also really interested, coinciding with that, in Robert Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, and again, his power of words and the phrases that he used to inspire these kinds of huge cultural shifts and movements. So in terms of, a recent kind of American figure, I think they're the two that I'd go back to. And I think the power of words is something that I'm always drawn to in history, be that from 800, 500, 100 years ago. The power of words to change things and to move people across time, and that kind of enduring movement as well, to hear words now that were spoken 50 years ago, 100 years ago or longer, and to still feel moved by them today, I think is something really incredibly powerful. And I feel that certainly when I look at words from people like Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy.
Owen?
I'm going to go for like a curveball, and it's someone that I talk fairly regularly to with Gareth Russell. And I'm going to say Margaret Brown, who is better known as the famous Molly Brown, who was a passenger on the Titanic and who was rather impressive on the night of the sinking, I think. And there's been a huge mythology built up around her over the centuries. I mean, she's starred in her own musical and has had whole books written about her and plays, and she's featured in many, many films. I find her absolutely fascinating, and I really love looking at what people do in times of peril, how they react, and what kind of legacy they leave behind. And I think she's got quite an impressive one.
And why is she, for the audience of Leaders and Legends, why is she known as the unsinkable?
So she's known as the unsinkable Molly Brown because she essentially refused to do what she was told in the lifeboat, essentially. She was very keen to return and pick up those who were very tragically flailing in the icy cold waters of the Atlantic. And she overrode, I think it was Hitchens, who was in command of her lifeboat. And she also mustered the women to row alongside her. And I think she took the tiller at one point as well. So yes, there's quite a contrast to my answer to Kate. This isn't someone who is known for their political power, but I quite often like looking at more ordinary acts of heroism.
Social history.
Yeah.
We were discussing Richard III, who was hacked to death at Bosworth, deservedly so, I may say, from this person's opinion, just based on the princes alone. Which British monarch do you believe had the most unjust and gruesome death? Owen?
Oh gosh, unjust and gruesome death.
Maybe it was gruesome and not unjust. Maybe it was unjust but not gruesome.
Who's the one that had poker shoved up his?
I think
Edward II.
Yeah, that was Edward II. Yeah.
I mean, that it's not a nice way to go.
That is gruesome.
And I can't think of many ways to justify that. So,
well, Mel Gibson in Braveheart basically just sealed Edward II's reputation forever.
Yes, no, definitely so.
That's a good one. I think. Sorry, we're hilariously and awfully really inventive, I think, with our methods of torture. The Brits have been in the past, and the English have been in the past. I mean, he's not a monarch. He was never a monarch, but one that always sticks to my mind as well is George, Duke of Clarence, was the brother of Richard III.
The Malmsey wine.
Yes, drowning himself in a barrel of Malmsey wine, which again is such just a bit of an iconic story, really gruesome, but what a way to go, I think some people might think. It's just fabulous tales like that.
You may have been drunk before you were drowned.
Exactly. And speaking of injustice, again, not monarchs necessarily, but consorts, obviously. The Catherine Howard and Anne Boleyn are two hugely unjust deaths there, I think, massively so in the executions. Yeah. But that's
which monarch do you believe is due for a reappraisal by historians?
That's a really brilliant question. And I think a lot of monarchs have been, certainly in the Tudor era, have been undergoing this kind of reappraisal in the last 20 odd years. One who stands out to me, but who is someone who has already begun their renaissance and their reappraisal very much so, is obviously Mary I and Bloody Mary, quote unquote, that she's maybe known more popularly as. But that's, I think, someone who has a very set reputation, very negative, gruesome reputation that is deservedly being overturned by a range of wonderful historians, past and present. And I think that's one that stands out to me from the Tudor era. But I think the Stuarts deserve a bit more attention.
Stolen my answer.
Well, Henry I is my favorite monarch, and I'm waiting for a new. I know there was the biography a long time ago of him, which I read. It's a brick, but it's worth reading. I'm hoping for a new one soon. Yeah. So the Stuarts all seem like just complete knuckleheads to me, drunk, whores, liars, even though I am Catholic. So I guess I'm a Jacobite. Actually, my family did flee England because we were Jacobites. So all the veins of the 16th and 17th, 18th century, those were all my forebears. Owen, go ahead. You want to stick up for the Stuarts?
Yeah, I think we have those tropes very much set in our minds. I think particularly here in the UK, we've had sort of an overload, I would guess, by the time you get to adulthood, of different interpretations and nuanced interpretations of who the Tudors were and what they did, and their legacy. Whereas I think with the Stuarts, you have a much more cursory understanding of their significance to the historical debate. And I think they need a cultural renaissance, because they're very rarely depicted on our television screens. And I'm sure a number of those tropes are true, but you very rarely get a sense of these people as people, of their everyday lives, of their loves, of their passions. So yeah, I'd love to see a bit of a Stuart Renaissance, to be honest. I'm putting myself out of a job here.
These are simple yes or no's. Are you ready? I mean, maybe not
okay.
simple, but I think they'll be relatively easy, perhaps. Would you have voted to execute Charles I?
No.
No, I don't like capital punishment.
Agree. Yeah.
Would you have voted to execute Anne Boleyn?
No. Big no.
That's what we call in the United States a layup. Would you have voted to execute Catherine Howard?
No.
What about any of Henry VIII's religious advisors, Sir Thomas More or?
No. These are boring answers from us, maybe, but no.
Would you have voted to execute, did I already ask you this, Catherine Howard?
No, I wouldn't. No.
She's a bit of a tart.
No, we can't judge her from 500 years ago standards. No, nobody deserved the axe, I don't think.
Would you have voted to execute Mary, Queen of Scots?
No, but I understand in a way why it was done.
I'd have given her a really, really lavish prison.
Susanna Lipscomb got all fired up. She goes, "They've executed her for treason. She's not English. She's not from there. What's the point?"
I know, it's complete hogwash, isn't it?
It is.
How could she have committed treason if she wasn't a citizen? It's just
it's ludicrous.
Amazing example of how our treason laws have shifted and changed over time, to the whims of the monarchs who've overseen their definition. Quite agree.
I wish Mary, Queen of Scots had social media, because she led one of the most star-crossed lives of anyone I've ever encountered in my reading. You feel sorry. I mean, I do. I just feel sorry for her at a certain point. I mean, you just bad decision after bad decision. Would you have voted to execute Lady Jane Grey?
No, poor Lady Jane.
You guys are softies.
I know.
Yeah. Really, really are. Yeah.
Dr. Tallis's book on Lady Jane Grey was amazing. I didn't know anything about her before I read it. Nothing, absolutely at all, other than, supposed to be the 9-day queen, but apparently the 13-day queen. And the book was fabulous. So you'd have let her go too?
Oh, yes.
Absolutely. We'd let her off.
Yeah. I'd probably give her a crown back as well.
Yeah.
She could be co-regnant with Mary.
Do you think that she should have been queen after Edward the Sixth?
No, I don't think she should have been. No.
I mean, it's so complex. I think if Edward had ratified his device for the succession with Parliament, he'd have had justification, but he didn't. So therefore, it really came down to who could control the country, and that was Mary.
If you could go back in time and box the ears of any English or British monarch other than Henry VIII, damn it, whom would you choose? If you're going to let Boleyn and Howard and all these people off the hook, then I know you're going to choose Henry VIII. So let's say Henry VIII's a bonus. Choose someone else.
I've got to box the ears. I have no choice.
Richard III. He was
good
a
one.
bad guy, maybe. Bad King John. Are we allowed to still call him Bad King John? He's a good one.
Yeah, probably just some random person who murdered someone or something.
That was probably most of them.
Yeah.
I think most of them. Yeah, I'd go for John. Yeah. John or Richard III, I think.
I just indiscriminately choose a murderer.
That doesn't narrow it down.
You may have already answered this question for sure. One of my Professor Sheila Cooper on my thesis committee would go on and on about, and it wasn't, obviously I was researching stuff that happened in the early 15th century, late 14th century, but she would go on and on how the Stuarts were the most important and impactful dynasty in British history. Whom would you choose for that title? You can say obvious. Stuarts. I'm just saying that it was very interesting that she was adamant that Stuarts changed British history more than any other dynasty.
I mean, I think it's really hard to predictably go past the Tudors if we're purely looking at it from the point of view of the break with Rome, which I think was one of the biggest shifts this country has ever had. And it, like Owen said, has echoes through to current politics today. I think that was arguably one of the most transformative things that any monarch has ever done, which would indicate the Tudors. But I don't know. I think even the most recent generation, the Windsors, have been hugely transformative in terms of how much has changed under their rule.
This is so tricky.
The cogs are turning in Owen's head. I can see it.
I want to say Dr. Gristwood said the Windsors, I think, which took me a little bit by surprise.
Yeah, they've seen so much change over the course of however long, 150 years. It's just been unreal. But then Victoria as well. They all have huge transformations happen underneath them.
This is the thing, that I think the further away you get from absolute monarchy, the harder it is to credit them with the changes which happened during their tenure.
That's very true.
It's a really difficult one.
But so many of them followed history. And and others created. I mean, Henry VIII created history, whether you like it or not.
I think I'll have to stick with Tudors, and just to glean back some of those points I lost when I said.
What is your favorite movie about British history?
I think we'll have the same answer. No, it's on the screen in the background.
Yeah, it is probably Anne of the Thousand Days. I love it so much.
I've not seen it, but it's on my list to see. I haven't seen it, but I want to see it. I actually did a podcast with a lady named Kate Anderson Brower, and she just wrote a brand new biography of Elizabeth Taylor. She's the daughter of Christopher Anderson, who I mentioned a few minutes ago. Okay. And her biography, Elizabeth Taylor, is magnificent. And so it made me think about wanting to watch that movie. Kate, you choosing the same one?
I think I'd have to. It's the film that I know made both Owen and I fall in love with this time period and fall in love with Anne, and probably is a large part of why we both work where we work today. So I think it'd be rude to not choose it.
It's a really problematic movie.
Yes.
It's,
Is it? Let me ask you a question, because I'm going to ask you. I was going to ask you it in a few minutes, but you just said that, so I'm going to ask it now, if that's okay. How do you? And I've asked Tracy and Sarah and Suzanne and Gareth, everybody, Nicola. How do you, as historians, watch movies without just beating your head against the wall? A friend of mine said, "Man, I'd like to watch Braveheart with you," and I laughed, and I go, "No, you wouldn't." I'm like, well, why not? I'm like, because that movie is so off. It's it's amazingly entertaining, but as history, it's basically a F. How do you watch movies and go, well, how do I look past this error or this artistic license?
You have to separate it in order to still enjoy it. And I think I used to be very much in the vein of, I would actually, and I still do, sometimes enjoy watching films that I know will make me angry at how historically inaccurate they are, because I like to get riled up by them. But there are those, like Anne of the Thousand Days, where personally, as long as you can separate, sort of as a disclaimer, almost before you watch the film, separate the fact from fiction, enjoy the work of fiction, then I think you can enjoy the artistry of it with the creative license, but not get too panicked about the details. I think as long as people know the difference between fact and fiction, there's not an issue. It's when that becomes blurred that there is an issue, which we do see a lot of the time, where people watch a film or a television series and take that as fact without doing the research themselves.
Yeah, I think because my gateway into history, into the history world, into historical locations like Eva, because it came through popular culture, I do find it very easy to separate historical facts from historical fiction. I love historical fact as pure as I possibly can get it, and but also as messy as I possibly can get it as well. I like complicated.
Rob Roy is another one, obviously.
Yeah, totally. But when it comes to historical fiction, I like trash, I'm afraid. I unashamedly love rubbish.
I'm getting ready to be honored by having Alexander Larman on the podcast. I think in the next month or so. His books on the Windsors are wonderful, and it made me think of the King's Speech and what a terrific movie that is. Which figure in English and British history represents the most consequential premature death?
Arthur.
Arthur's such a good shout.
Yeah,
it has to be Prince Arthur, Henry VIII's older brother, who died before him.
Yeah.
God, what would have happened if Henry VIII had never come to the throne?
I often think how, when would the Reformation have hit? Would there have been a break with Rome? When would that have been? Would he have had a child with Catherine? Would the Tudor dynasty have been this unending, fruitful one? So many what ifs. Yeah.
Henry V was my choice when I had to answer these same questions. What do you think? Who do you think is the most overrated person in British history? And I will tell you, if you hadn't listened to any of my podcasts, which is perfectly fine, you're very busy people, that Susanna Lipscomb said it was Queen Elizabeth I.
Ooh.
And I thought Tracy Borman was going to have an aneurysm.
Controversial. You're going with that?
Yeah, I am. I'm going to go with it. And this is not because I dislike Elizabeth. I adore her. I'm absolutely fascinated by her. But I'm not fascinated by Gloriana. I'm fascinated by the woman. And unfortunately, we, particularly at a primary and maybe even the secondary level, only ever get to explore Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the myth.
The image of her.
Yeah, exactly. The image, the perpetual youth mask, which never really existed. And actually, everything's far, far more messier than that, far more complicated, far more interesting. So my answer comes with a caveat that it's the myth of Elizabeth that's overrated. And actually, the real Elizabeth is far more interesting.
I can't disagree on Elizabeth because I love her too much, but I do respect what you're saying. But I would say Henry VIII. My goodness, no. Give the voices back to the people around him, to the women around him, to his wives. Give the agency back to them. We're bored of hearing his story. It's time for her story. Gosh, that's great, isn't it?
But how? If Henry VIII, I mean, what's the quote about the devil? If he didn't exist, you'd have to invent him or something. I forget who said that. I mean,
he needs to exist. He's an important part of history, but he's been done to death, and I'm far more interested now in the people around him who are enacting change rather than him, his grumpy self.
It's time to sit down, Henry.
It's time to sit back, Henry.
What about Richard the Lionheart?
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah,
he's a good candidate. He's sort of a part of real British folklore almost here, I think, in terms of how important he's seen as being. He's almost like a mythical figure, I think, here. But it's an interesting candidate, I would say.
Yeah.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. We have a few more minutes with Dr. Owen Emmerson and Kate McCaffrey of Iver Castle in Kent in Great Britain. It is a beautiful, beautiful place. And I don't know, is it at Iver Castle on Twitter?
Yes, it's just at Iver Castle.
Yeah, please follow. It's beautiful pictures, constant pictures, wonderful speakers, and visitors. It's a terrific Twitter account, for lack of a better term. Who do you think is the most underrated person in English history? I say Henry I only because I'm predictable.
Yeah, Henry I is a good one. Underrated.
It doesn't have to be a monarch. It could be.
Okay. Oh gosh, underrated person. It's funny, isn't it? I think obviously our specialty being around the Tudor era, that's where my mind goes to straight away. I often think of Lady Jane Grey. I know you mentioned Nicola Tallis's incredible book on her. I think she's a figure who we know so little about still, but it's one that there is a lot more to explore there. But on that same vein, and also following Nicola's amazing books, I would say Margaret Beaufort is someone who always fascinates me. She's been that kind of love or hate figure, I think, that she's been painted out to be. And as the sort of matriarch of the Tudor dynasty, I think she is underrated, or is often painted in purely one light, which is usually negative. And I think she's really fascinating and multifaceted. So maybe I'd say Margaret Beaufort.
Yeah, and just real quick, she's
the mother of Henry VII, and so the grandmother of Henry VIII, and the founder of the Tudor dynasty in many ways.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree with both of those. I think they're really good candidates. Mine definitely isn't the most underrated person in history. But sticking with the Tudor theme, because that's where we are employed, Anne of Cleves.
Oh, yeah.
Everything you know about Anne of Cleves is wrong, and she is fascinating.
And she lived at the castle, is that right?
She did. She owned Hever, or rather she rented Hever for 17 years from the Crown. And I think she is a fabulous, very interesting individual. And I really love to see how she carved out an existence for herself in the confines of a very sort of meager allowance. Yeah.
She's like, to me, she hit the lottery. Like,
yeah,
it didn't work out, but still.
Yeah, I guess it depends what you think the jackpot is. You know, she had always been bred to be a queen, and therefore the terms in which she won her lottery were Henry's and not hers. So, you know, and all of the largesse that she got from Henry were contingent on her not returning to her homeland and never marrying again. So I don't think she was necessarily able to fulfill any of her family or her ambitions. But she did the best by the lot that she was given.
You wonder what she actually looked like?
Yeah, I think she was fairly good looking. Certainly those around her thought she was. And again, this is why I say a lot of what we know about Anne of Cleves is just rubbish.
Why do you think Henry VIII was so repelled?
I think
that's the right term.
Yeah, no, it is. I think she didn't know who he was when he walked in disguise at Rochester during their first meeting. She was believing she would be meeting Henry later on in her travels, and he decided to spring upon her. And I think for the very first time in his life, he got an honest reaction as to how fat, ugly, and bloated he was, because she had no idea who he was. And I think she, in that moment, became his mirror, and he hated it, and therefore decided that she was fat, smelly, and ugly.
Is that what happens these days too? I believe.
Yeah.
We have reached the point on the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Owen and Kate, are you ready?
Ready.
Do you want to go ladies first on all of these questions?
Absolutely.
Yep. I'll take the reins.
Kate, what was your first job?
My first job, hilariously, was actually here at Hever Castle. I did work experience here as a 16-year-old, and then I stayed on to be employed as a steward and a guide in the castle. Then I went away to do my degrees and came back in my current capacity as a curator, and I have never left, in a way, I suppose you could say. This place is within me very much.
Beautiful. Owen?
My first job was in a clothes shop at the local airport.
At Heathrow or which one?
No, Gatwick.
Gatwick?
Yeah.
Number 2, what was your first concert?
So I can't actually remember my first concert, but the first concert I remember being really excited about was a Taylor Swift concert when I was about 13. And I'm a big Swiftie, just to announce that to everyone. So yeah, it was the Taylor Swift concert that I went to see with my best friend and my mum. And it's still one of my happy memories.
Imagine if Henry had seen Taylor Swift. Owen?
Case is really cool. I went to see Elaine Page singing the songs of Edith Piaf when I was 9 years old, which tells you pretty much everything you need to know about what a nerd I was.
That's iconic.
Number 3. Okay, these last 3 are difficult, but that's okay. No grades included. Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Now, this is a really difficult one, but I'm going to go with a book that was edited by Professor Susanna Lipscomb, who you've mentioned, and also Helen Carr, who you've also mentioned, which is called What is History Now? And it's in the image of E.H. Carr, who actually was Helen's great-grandfather, his seminal work, What is History, in the 20th century, and they've refreshed it. It's a selection of essays from a range of amazing historians, and it examines the question of what history means to us today with all the new lenses that we look on it through our modern eyes. And I think it's a must read for anyone who's interested in history in general.
I would love to have Professor Carr on the podcast, especially because I don't know her. I think I've reached out to her once and maybe didn't get a response, but that's okay. But that was before Dr. Lipscomb came on, because her book on John of Gaunt would have references to my thesis subject, Sir Thomas Erpingham, because he was indentured to Gaunt in 1380. So it would be interesting to talk to her about that. And who's the other one? Jane Ridley. I read her biography of George V. It was superb. I'd love to have her on. Actually bought her biography of Edward VII and haven't gotten to it yet, but I will. Forgive me. Owen?
Mine's
which book?
The Life and Death of Anne Boleyn by Eric Ives. It's widely seen as sort of the canonical book on Anne Boleyn. Things have moved on quite a bit since his interventions, which were sort of revolutionary in their time. But it's kind of the Bible still here at Hever, isn't it?
Definitely.
So yeah, that's my must-read recommendation.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Again, a really tough one, but I'm going to go with Anne Boleyn's coronation, where she was actually 6 months pregnant with Elizabeth I, although obviously they didn't know that at the time. And she was the first and only queen consort to be crowned with St. Edward's crown, which was usually reserved for monarchs only. So I think that day was probably the pinnacle of Anne's triumph, and I would have loved to have witnessed the pomp and ceremony surrounding it.
That's a good one. I would come to Hever Castle for Christmas 1526. All the Boleyns were here. It's widely understood as the time in which Anne decided to do the unthinkable and say yes to Henry VIII. And I just want to know what all those conversations were like here. I'd love to be a fly on the wall, even better, a guest at the table. And I just love to know what was being said. And
yes to sex or yes to marriage?
Yes to marriage, definitely not sex. She
made him wait.
Yeah, she made him wait. Definitely.
Poor Henry. Last one. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record, just to chat, whom would you choose?
So I'm going to go with a really left field answer here, but I'm a huge fan of Liverpool Football Club. So I'm going to say Jurgen Klopp, who is Liverpool's manager and who is a figure who I would love to grill his brains about what's going on at the moment behind the scenes. So I'm going to go with Jurgen Klopp.
Amazing. I would go for Rufus Wainwright, who's one of my favourite singer-songwriter writers and opera writers and all-round genius.
If you could have dinner with Kate or Megan, whom would you choose?
Oh, Megan.
I think Megan would be more fun.
Definitely. Get all the tea, wouldn't
All the
you? Whereas
gossip.
Kate would be really like sensible and reserved.
She would. She wouldn't give anything away, but Megan would spill the secrets.
Oh, yeah.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our guests have been Dr. Owen Emmerson and Kate McCaffrey. They work and run and are the stewards of the beautiful Iver Castle. Thank you so much for your time. I know you stayed late over there in England. I love the conversation. You were delightful. I'm very grateful.
Oh, thank you so much for having us. It's been an absolute thrill.
Yeah, it's been a real honor. So thank you for having us on.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.
This podcast was produced and edited by Chris Spangle and Leaders and Legends LLC. If you're interested in starting a podcast or taking yours to the next level, please contact us at leadersandlegends.net.